You're watching Beyond Market. Welcome, I'm Esther Awuni. Many thanks for joining us. On today's show, we'll discuss global trade and the African youth. As always, you can join today's conversation with the hashtag Beyond Market. You can also send your comments or your thoughts to my Twitter handle too. It's at Esther O. Awuni. Now, independent strategy advisor Shawn Hagedorn says youth populations are now declining or plunging in all regions except the least globally integrated region, that's Sub-Saharan Africa, where they are surging. According to him, this region needs commercially clever ways to exploit this rapidly growing youth population. He joins me now to discuss this. Shawn, thank you for taking the time out to join us today.
Hi, Esther.
Now, let's start with we're talking trade and we're talking youth today, but let's start with the youth population. Now, oftentimes, Africa's youth population is referred to as a demographic dividend, meaning that there are so many things to be gained, so many advantages for African governments to benefit from, especially now that we're talking a lot about growing a weak consumer demand across the globe, which is also feeding into the trade wars that we're seeing. But for African policymakers, they're also grappling with high unemployment, underskilled workers. And I'm just wondering, how do they take advantage of the advantages that come with this growing youth population, at the same time tackling these issues of youth unemployment?
Right, so to really condense my whole point as much as possible, the demographic dividend is a plus if it's accompanied by a great deal of global integration, and by that I mean more and more young people being involved in contributing to value-added goods and services.
But you also say that, right now Africa is at a place where there's talk about integration, and African policymakers, African governments rather, are putting their money where their mouth is. I'm talking about the African Continental Free Trade Area, where they're hoping that there will be better regional integration, and of course boosting consumer, hoping that there will be better, higher consumer spending. But you are saying that there is excessive expectations for the African Continental Free Trade Area and what it could do for boosting growth on the continent. Could you share more insight on that?
Right. So, and I do feel very strongly about that. And a lot of it's just mathematical. So, if you look at the broad numbers, so Africa is about 15% of the world population, but it's only about 3% of global GDP, and it's only about 1% of discretionary income. And really, what drives economic development is poor communities selling to wealthy communities. Or nation societies that have a lot of discretionary income. Then you can really accelerate economic development. And then that's really at the heart of the rise of Asia, perhaps the most amazing thing that's ever happened. And people get confused. Obviously, Asia industrialized massively, but there's no way that all those Asian countries could have grown as fast as they did for as long as they did, create as much broad upliftment without having been focused on exporting to wealthier consumers in other parts of the world. And so, trade, it's great that African countries trade among themselves, but there just isn't the purchasing power to fuel broad, rapid upliftment. It's mathematics.
Now, for these Asian countries, which you also use as an example in your notes, you also talk about how they diligently tracked certain indicators to give them a broad and a good view as to how, the level or the strength of consumer spending, what these people are buying, and just general household wealth building indicators. Is this something that you're seeing already here in Sub-Saharan Africa?
No, I don't think there's nearly enough momentum in that regard. And the other thing is we have to back up a little bit, if you don't mind. The world is really rapidly changing. People talk about the fourth industrial revolution and all of that. So we have a dramatic demographic shift. And the global economy is very much shifting, and the trade wars to a large extent reflect this. And overall, it's good that there is a lot of young people in Africa If they find jobs where they integrate into the global economy, it's going to be much easier for them to find those jobs because of things like the fourth industrial revolution, because a lot of what's happening there is there's new opportunities. That's massive. And then the other one is, it's an economic term, but it's easy to follow, market access. So the cost of transporting digital content is zero, and it's instantaneous. And that's completely new versus the world economy of, say, 50 years ago, or really even less than 50 years ago.
But you have said that for the entrepreneurs, if I read that correctly, the entrepreneurs here, especially in South Africa, if they can find good export channels, that could be a big plus. Could you shed more light on that?
Yeah, no, that's really the key. And that's going to be the key across Africa. So the global economy really, is changing. It's becoming more digital, more information age, more services. We live in a services led economy. That's where the growth is coming from, not manufacturing. So the very specifics are impossible to predict. I mean, like, we don't know what the next killer app is going to be on your cell phone. But we do know that it's probably going to come from young people, creative young people somewhere in the planet who have life experiences which are different than other people in other parts of the planet, and where there's value through sharing. And so it shouldn't be that government policymakers try to be overly prescriptive, and they're saying, okay, it's going to be this, this, and this, because they love industrial growth. And that age is coming to a close, was giving way. And so it's impossible to predict what the various export channels will be. I mean, if you go on to Google or Apple and look at their application stores, it's not as if there's clever people at Google, Apple that they're prescriptive, that they're trying to decide what the latest app should be, but they're creating a platform. And that's really what needs to happen between Africa and the rest of the world. You need to create those channels, the service platforms.
Well, quickly, briefly talk to us about the situation in South Africa. I mean, the youth population, you say that it's moderate growth at this time, but there's still weak consumer spending. Just help us understand the situation as it's playing out in South Africa.
South Africa's economy is not doing well at all. For the last 10 years, there's been no growth in per capita income, which is terrible when you consider the elevated levels of poverty and unemployment. And over the next 10 years, it doesn't look like it's really going to be much better, certainly over the next 5 years. And a lot of that, if you trace it back, and I've been saying this on your show, Beyond Markets, going back like 5 years, the economy is just way too inward-looking. The regulatory bias is incredibly inward-looking. And so mathematically it doesn't work. And then what the article tries to bring into it as well is, so then what happens is, if you were tracking what's going on at a household level, as I've been doing for a long time, there's a lot of clues there. They're just, you're not increasing the power of the consumers at the family household level because the workers aren't increasing productivity fast enough, and there's way too much debt. So there's all those mistakes which can be corrected. They take a while, and then the article goes on a little bit farther to say you need better metrics. You need to track that better.
But you also mentioned the central banks and the using or reducing interest rates, and saying that is no longer effective because it doesn't basically get young people to spend, and and also the older population are not also keen to spend. Could you shed more light on that?
Yeah, no, this is a crazy thing. It's a big thing. So people, and there's economists talk about the Phillips curve and these things. So all of these metrics and relationships that used to work don't work as well when you have a really abrupt shift in demographics, which is what we're having happen now. So if central banks lower rates, like in Europe, lower and lower, it doesn't really induce such an increase in spending because, in Europe, a lot of the population of the countries are older, and older people don't go out and borrow to buy a new car just because interest rates went down. That was much more effective when you had rising youth populations. So that's that's something that's happening, and then that also ties into, there's another economic term, secular stagnation. The issue in capital markets is it's called beyond markets. The issue in capital markets, the focus is always on recessions, because that's what central bankers look at, because they're focused on the business cycle. And then in capital markets, people use the core interest rates to price securities. But in the larger economy, where people live and work, what really drives outcomes is the long-term trajectories. And that's why people are so scared about something called secular stagnation. And that ties into the trade war. And I've just wrapped a lot together there. But the interest rates have become much less effective at driving growth. And they really don't have much effect at driving long-term growth. And you're also seeing that now in the news stories about the new IMF head, and now what's going to happen at the ECB in terms of whether they're going to continue to try to drive interest rates lower, or whether they're going to push for structural changes.
Now, in terms of boosting domestic demand, in terms of boosting household spending for the South African authorities or policymakers, what recommendations do you have for them that perhaps you've seen, perhaps a country like China may have done, or maybe one or two other Asian countries that can put the economy back on growth and, of course, boost that much-needed domestic demand?
Right. Okay, so it really is like this. If you were to go and look at the 5 or 6, maybe even 10 of the main things which China got right and have resulted in their per capita income has increased from like barely $200 per person 40 years ago to about $8,000 today. It's completely extraordinary. If you look at like the 5, maybe up to 10 things that they did that made that happen, South Africa's policy on every one is almost exactly the opposite. South Africa was never, the economy's never been focused on value-added exporting. And at the family level, there hasn't been a focus on savings. But if you're looking to your local domestic consumers to drive growth, then they can't save. And that's why this is mathematical. And it's really the Japanese who worked this out a long time ago. And then one country after another copied them. And oddly enough, China came a little bit late and did a great job of it. So at the family level, you have to have invest in education, and you have to have stable household finances. Otherwise, you're always making desperate decisions, and it's very difficult to escape poverty under those circumstances.
All right, Shawn, well, thank you for your time so far. We'll take a short break right now, and we'll be right back to pick up from where we left off. I've been speaking to Shawn Hagedorn. He's an independent strategy advisor looking at, of course, Africa's youth population and global. If you're just joining us, Shawn Hagedorn, independent strategy advisor, is with me, and we are discussing global trade and the African youth. Shawn, thank you for your time so far. Let's pick up from where we left off. Now, this time, just tilting towards trade this time. Now, you've said that disruptions in South Africa's fund management industry are unrelenting, and you also say that fund managers within the space need to take a step back and reassess how the space, how the ecosystem is changing. But I'd like you to just help us, first of all, see the picture that's happening or that's playing out in South Africa. What are these challenges and what are these disruptions that are taking place?
You touched on the fund management aspect. I mean, maybe I should take just a moment to explain what's going on there and then drift into the South African situation. So in the fund management industry, forever, fund managers would charge 1% or whatever, and they would call that active management. And now that's under threat globally by what they call passive management, where people pay a lot less than 1%. And then I tried to bring into the article how what used to be called socially responsible investing, now sometimes called ESG, environment, social and governance investing, how that's kind of a third wave, and that could really be a savior for the fund management industry, which does create a lot of value. I do want to make that point, even though a lot of people are very well paid, and that's sort of critical from a societal perspective. And so with all of that as background, so in South Africa, the economic policies that have been in place for decades now have proven to be ineffective. And so there is real potential for the fund management industry to develop the metrics that are necessary to guide policymakers. And the way you would do that is for socially responsible investing to focus more on what's happening at the household level. And so that doesn't exist really today. And in South Africa, the article argues is particularly well positioned to lead globally in that regard.
I'm just wondering, because this social investing sort of sounds like a silver bullet. It probably isn't, but it sounds like one. But how fast or how soon can this begin to, can fund managers begin to look at this part of investing and make it work for them?
And just a little bit of history, social responsible investing has been a minor subset of the fund management industry for a long time. Where first gained prominence was in the 80s regarding South Africa in the sanctions era to exclude investments in South Africa. So there's a real sort of link there. South Africa's relevance has been high from the start. And so what socially responsible investing has kind of grown up as is being excluding undesirable investments, in defense spending or if not military, maybe tobacco, alcohol, those sorts of things. But what I'm arguing in favor of where there's a real gap is that policymakers, and particularly in countries with high unemployment and high poverty, is they don't get the feedback of what's going on in households from the capital markets that they do with the macroeconomic indicators. So if the debt is, if the national debt is creating a problem, the capital markets provides a lot of feedback to policymakers. But if households are becoming over-indebted, as the way things are structured today, that doesn't really happen. And South Africa has really proven that. It's been ignored for a long time to where it is a crisis now. And as a result, South Africa does not have the domestic purchasing power to overcome the country's poverty and unemployment.
Now, while all of that is happening, because I mean, just thinking about it all, it's all interconnected. I mean, this household spending, weak global demand, the trade wars we're seeing, and of course, how fund managers who are on one hand, looking across the investment landscape, still trying to get very good returns on their investment. But for these fund managers themselves, how, in your words or your thoughts, how are they processing this global trade spats, especially between the US and China, and how it could actually snowball? Because it doesn't look like things are letting up anytime soon.
Well, I'm very keen to answer that. So I wrote an article late last year about the trade spat, kind of anticipating that portfolio managers weren't going to get this right. Their focus, they price securities. That's what capital markets do. And it's a hugely valuable function. It raises living standards dramatically. So fund managers, capital market participants, they add a lot of value. But I touch on this in the article. So if you're the leaders in China and you look at what happened in 2008, it looked like the capital markets, sort of the Western system, it doesn't work very well because the economies were on the verge of crumbling. And whereas the Chinese, they very much look at, their leaders very much look at what are the long-term trajectories. So then if you say, well, hang on, if the fund managers to price securities, as I said earlier, they really have to look at what the central banks are doing and what's going on with interest rates, because those formulas, they drive the valuations, the prices that come out. It's very mathematical. So then there's a big piece of the puzzle that's missing, is you don't really get a whole lot of information that's going on the ground, particularly at the household level. And this is a big opportunity for fund managers to add more value, and they can charge for that. And it's win-win all around. And where it is easiest to see that you can create a lot of value there is South Africa, and that's because South Africa was among the first countries to go into long-term stagnation. But now there's a risk that a lot of other countries will do that as well. But South Africa, it almost drove directly there through policy errors, and the metrics weren't there. It was if capital markets were providing more feedback through appropriate metrics, maybe South Africa wouldn't be in the midst of 20 years of per capita income stagnation, which is devastating.
But if the country doesn't take advantage of this window now, could it end up being a missed opportunity?
The South Africa cannot stay on the track that it's on. But I mean, I was saying this on your show, 5 years ago. South Africa's policies have induced poverty traps and debt traps, and now there needs to be a new model. But really, what it comes down to, like the biggest thing that needs to be accepted, is the country absolutely has to increase value-added exports. Otherwise, mathematically, failure is pretty much inevitable. And that's the path we're on now.
Now, beyond Sub-Saharan Africa, I mean, there's still the issue of global shortage of adequate consumer demand. I'm just curious, I mean, how this is going to play out, where this is going to lead up to, because I mean, central bank governors, they're doing the best they can, still, tinkering with interest rates, not having the much desired effect so far. But I'm just wondering, what end game do you see here?
I think the important thing to keep in mind, so there are a lot of countries, look, it's mostly in the West, that they really have generations of wealth accumulate. When grandma, grandpa dies, the estates are, oftentimes they're pretty substantial. So they have a lot of wherewithal, okay? And then you have the emerging countries in Asia where, I mean, the Japanese have been wealthy for quite a while, but in many other cases, you just don't have the family wealth. And so there's that, and then you have what the article's about, is a declining youth population. So normally what you used to do is you would want to have people going out, creating families, borrowing lots of money, and that would drive the economy, the economic growth. So that plays a smaller role, whereas you still have these pockets of huge accumulated wealth over generations. And really, if you keep that in mind, then the trade wars are much easier to understand, because China knows it needs to tap into a lot more consumption from the West, mostly, because that's where most of the accumulated wealth is, and that's what makes the sanctions so effective. And that's why we're shifting from and people don't want to talk about this. It's very awkward, and a lot comes into it, which is awkward to talk about. But that's why we're shifting from central bankers having kind of driven the boat as far as they could, and they're no longer effective. But the sanctions, Donald Trump's sanctions, they're now changing the landscape quite a bit. And the Chinese, they really know that this threatens their long-term plan.
So, Shawn, let me ask you this: if there is one lesson that Sub-Saharan Africa can learn from China, what would that be?
Value-added exporting, to shift away from focusing on commodities and even focusing away from thinking about regional trade to value-added exporting to deep consumer markets, which is mostly the West and increasingly Asia.
But that is what the Africa Continental Free Trade Area, I know you've said that, it could be prescriptive. It could be, I mean, it's too much focus on it or overthinking it. But I'm just thinking, but if African governments can get that right, surely, I mean, for farmers, for example, they could get connected to both regional and global value chains. Isn't that a plus?
Well, absolutely. And look, I'm not anti the free trade pact at all. But just on farmers, just to get the economics, make it quite simple. So let's say you farm mealies and I farm wheat, and we have modest-sized farms, and then we trade a bit with each other. That has no real effect. We're not going to get, if we were poor to start with, we're going to stay poor for a long, long time. But then if our children, if one or two of them then suddenly learns how to code and is developing apps, which is sold all over the world, or working for some big company far away, that's when things really change. Then suddenly, they're tapping into global consumers, and you can sustain very high growth rates.
All right, Shawn, thank you so much for talking to us today. We appreciate your time. I've been speaking to Shawn Hagedorn, Independent Strategy Advisor. Well, that's our show for today. Thank you so much for being a part of it. Remember that you can watch the show at 5 p.m. West African time daily and have access to all previous episodes of Beyond Markets on our website at cnbcafrica.com. You can also stay engaged with the hashtag that's Beyond Markets, and then you can also send your thoughts, your comments to my Twitter handle too. That's at Esther O. Awuni. For myself and the team, it's bye for now.